One thing I've been feeling quite a lot lately is sort of like deja vu, except I don't think it counts as deja vu if you actually have lived through it before. So I don't think it's a glitch in the Matrix. I think it's just the fact that politics is politics and always is. So we've got a recent story here about the 1970s inflation. I'm old enough to remember that, and yeah, things sound a lot familiar as we'll go through this by Peter Sutterman. He says, by October 1979, Americans agreed by an overwhelming margin that inflation was the most important issue facing the country. 40% named it as their top concern. Another 20% said it was an important problem, if not the most important. And 8% said the nation's biggest issue was the economy, which, of course, stagnant wages, rising prices, inflation. Even those who named energy as the biggest issue were worried about supply constraints and spiraling costs. And remember, at this point, you had the energy crunch, as they called it, trying to get everyone to cut down on their energy use because, of course, it's all OPEC's fault, right? We'll get to that. All right, inflation, as measured by CPI, hit 13.3% in 1979, its highest level in more than 3 decades. They saw dramatically slower overall economic growth than in the previous 2 decades, and a substantial reduction in typical family income, even as 2-earner households became more common with the mass entry of women into the workforce. So you've got more households with a double income, and people are still feeling it. You know, a double income should mean you're doing great, right? But no, inflation was eating into family earnings to the point where some were making more on paper, yet found themselves with reduced buying power, which is what inflation does. And by summer of 1979, 84% of Americans told Gallup that the country was on the wrong track. Inflation was the single metric by which the country's failures and foibles could be measured. So, going down a bit, I'm not going to read through this whole thing, but I remember this. I wasn't alive for this, but I remember reading about it. Time magazine in December of 1965 dedicated a cover story to John Maynard Keynes, and it declared in its title, "We're all Keynesians now." So yeah, this is where you finally get this idea of John Maynard Keynes being like the greatest economy ever. As they say, initially, Keynes was thought of as little but a left-wing mischief maker. But by the mid-1960s, his ideas had been so widely accepted that they constitute both the new orthodoxy in the universities and the touchstone of economic management in Washington. They have led to a greater degree of government involvement in the nation's economy than ever before in time of general peace. And they quoted Charles L. Schultz, the White House budget director. "We can't prevent every little wiggle in the economic cycle, but we can now prevent a major slide." You remember them saying that prior to the 2008 crash? You know, you had a lot of Austrian economists, and, you know, Ron Paul was trying to, you know, call attention to them that, you know, there's this housing bubble and troubles are ahead, and all the pundits and everyone were laughing at him, ha ha ha, and they had all these economists on to say, no, it's great, we Keynesians, we're wonderful, we've beat the boom and bust cycle. Yep. Anytime a Keynesian says we've beat the boom and bust cycle, prepare, because a bad one's coming. Alright, Schulze was first a deputy in the White House Budget Office under JFK. He would later serve as LBJ's budget chief, as well as Carter's top economic advisor, creating a continuity of policy between nearly 2 decades of Democratic administrations. Johnson was the Oval Office architect of what became known as the Great Society, explicitly portrayed as a sequel in spirit to the New Deal. In addition to the healthcare programs Medicare and Medicaid, the Great Society featured a bundle of programs designed to lift up the poor, which Johnson dubbed the War on Poverty. Kennedy had already embarked on an anti-poverty initiative structured as a 10-city demonstration program, but Johnson wanted more than a series of pilots. Yeah, to Kennedy's credit, he was kind of skeptical about this, and he was like, well, why don't we just try a little bit of this and see how it goes? And then Johnson gets in, and he wants to go whole hog. He was determined not to start small. Instead, his program had to be big and bold and hit the whole nation with real impact. Yeah, well, it did that, didn't it? I've got a whole video on poverty and how this whole thing ended up being a complete failure. It wasn't so much that the war on poverty itself drove inflation, but Johnson's unchecked ambitions for new federal programs and economic intervention set the stage for the economic turmoil of the 1970s. His desire for big and bold federal programs summed up the policy hubris that ran through the political establishment, especially, but not only, among liberals. By far the biggest components of the Great Society were healthcare, Medicare, and Medicaid, which swiftly outpaced their initial spending projections and coincided with rapid expansions of healthcare spending in the economy. Before Medicare and Medicaid in 1966, healthcare spending had been around 5% of GDP. By 1980, that figure was nearly 9% and rising quickly. Overall spending exploded in the late 60s, growing at double-digit rates most years, partly because of Great Society spending and partly due to escalating costs of the war in Vietnam. Most economists and politicians of the era misunderstood the causes of inflation. As inflation began to tick up in the late 60s, Johnson's Council of Economic Advisors blamed monopolies. Their solutions were a mix of antitrust and bully pulpit pressure. Now, lest you think Republicans are blameless, President Richard Nixon pressured businesses to hold down prices and wages, but the inflation rate continued to climb. In 1965, Nixon had insisted that the lesson that government price fixing doesn't work is never learned, and during his campaign, he promised he would not take this nation down the road of wage and price controls. And so I'm going to give you a clip right now. This is from Nixon's policy address on economic productivity and policy, and he made this address on June 17th, 1970. Take a listen.
Now here's what I will not do. I will not take this nation down the road of wage and price controls, however politically expedient that may seem. Controls and rationing may seem like an easy way out, but they are really an easy way in to more trouble, to the explosion that follows when you try to clamp a lid on a rising head of steam without turning down the fire under the pot. Wage and price controls only postpone a day of reckoning, and in so doing they rob every American of a very important part of his freedom.
Pretty decisive, right? Pretty clear? Not much gray area there? Well, when inflation hit 6% in 1971, that's exactly what he did. In August 1971, Nixon delivered a prime-time speech. Why don't I just play a bit of this too? And this is President Nixon's address to the nation outlining a new economic policy, the challenge of peace, on August 15th, 1971. Take a listen.
The time has come for decisive action, action that will break the vicious circle of spiraling prices and costs. I am today ordering a freeze on all prices and wages throughout the United States for a period of 90 days. In addition, I call upon corporations to extend the wage price freeze to all dividends. I have today appointed a cost of living council within the government. I have directed this council to work with leaders of labor and business to set up the proper mechanism for achieving continued price and wage stability after the 90-day freeze is over.
Now, this story doesn't get into it, but listen to what else this speech said.
I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to take the action necessary to defend the dollar against the speculators. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States.
So yeah, you see how well that worked. You also see how temporary it was, right? Undeterred, Nixon briefly reinstated a freeze on prices in 1973. Not only did he fail to learn the lesson that price controls don't work, he made the same mistake twice. So then you've got Gerald Ford. Whip inflation now, or when. Yep, voters need to cut their expenses, live a little more frugally, and wear catchphrase printed pins on their lapels. Inflation apparently could not possibly have been the fault of politicians or policymakers. It had to be someone else. For Johnson, the culprit was corporations. For Nixon, it was employers paying unapproved wages. For Ford, it was the voters themselves. Yep, you see, you people, you have to cut back on your expenses. What, us politicians? We're not cutting back. No. Congressional budgets? No, they're not being cut back. You people are the ones. It's your fault. It's your fault you going out there and spending all this extra money for stuff. It's not our fault. By the time Carter became president, inflation so bedeviled the administration's fortunes that it produced sentences from American officialdom like this one. Between 1973 and 1975, we had the deepest banana that we had in 35 years, and yet inflation dipped only briefly. So this was Alfred Kahn, Carter's top economist on his inflation task force. He'd started saying banana instead of recession. He didn't like the word recession, so just call it a banana. I doubt Orwell even saw that one coming. Alright, so then you've got that famous Carter-Reagan debate in the 1980 election. And I'm old enough to remember the 1980 election. I would have been 12. And I remember this over and over again. The Republicans, every other word out of their mouth, or every other three words, double-digit inflation, double-digit inflation, double-digit inflation. That was basically their rallying cry. Because the Democrats had messed up everything so much, even though it's a lot of blame goes to Nixon too. But yeah, that was what they were hitting, double-digit inflation. You know, don't re-elect Carter or we'll have double, we might even have triple-digit inflation, who knows. So Carter dodged and deflected, blaming OPEC for raising oil prices. Does this sound familiar? And defending his lackluster economy on the grounds that the recession that resulted this time was the briefest we've had since the Second World War. Plus, he said job creation was strong with 9 million new jobs. Do you recognize the rhetoric, people? Is this sounding familiar? Is this sounding like something like maybe you don't want to be falling for when another particular politician gets on TV and says the same thing? Reagan's plan to cut income taxes could result in a 30% inflation rate, he said. And in a follow-up, he returned to the old idea that it was the economic indulgences of the American people that were relevant to rising prices. We have demanded that the American people sacrifice. Again, you need to sacrifice. What? Us sacrifice? Us spend less? No. We're not the ones who have to cut back. You people are the ones who have to do it. So when Reagan got a chance to answer the same question, I think this idea that has been spawned here in our country, that inflation somehow came upon us like a plague, and therefore it's uncontrollable and no one can do anything about it, is entirely spurious. He noted Carter's broken promises on the economy, cited the millions of Americans still out of work, and rebuked the president for trying to escape blame. Carter, Reagan said, had blamed the people for inflation, OPEC, he's blamed the Federal Reserve System, he blamed the lack of productivity of the American people, he then accused the people of living too well and that we must share in scarcity, we must sacrifice and get used to doing with less. We don't have inflation because the people are living too well. We have inflation because the government is living too well. All right. Gotta give Reagan applause for that one. And yeah, it went over great with voters too, so. All right, here's something else we've heard before. Through the 60s and 70s, economic policymakers had believed there was a direct trade-off between unemployment and inflation. Remember the Phillips curve? We've talked about that before. Probably the most debunked idea in all of economics, and they still won't let it go. And they had expressed a preference for inflation if it meant keeping unemployment down. In the 1960s, oh, you know these guys, Nobel Prize-winning economists Paul Samuelson and Robert Solow argued that in order to keep unemployment around 3%, policymakers should be willing to accept the price index might have to rise by as much as 4 to 5% a year. That much price rise would seem to be the necessary cost of high employment. And of course, Kennedy was pushing low interest rates, hoping to spur rapid economic growth. This approach was passed on to successive administrations. By 1971, reeling from political backlash to a recession, Nixon reportedly said, "We'll take inflation if necessary, but we can't take unemployment." And he also wanted cheap interest rates. He pressured his Fed chief Arthur Burns to follow through. In 1971, he said, "What we're going to do first is have an expansionary budget." We also, according to Dr. Arthur Burns, will have an expansionary monetary policy that will, of course, be a monetary policy adequate to meet the needs of an expanding economy. Why am I reminded of that Ashley Brilliant quote, "Bureaucracy is expanding to meet the needs of an expanding bureaucracy"? So, hey, another Nobel Prize-winning economist, Milton Friedman, famously said, "Inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, in the sense that it is and can be produced only by a more rapid increase in the quantity of money than in output." And the United States had consciously chosen to inflate its currency. It made that choice because of the political ideology and personal weakness of the men entrusted with the job of managing the American economy, their utopianism, their arrogance, and then, finally, their cowardice. Okay, so let's bring it to the present. In late January 2021, just days after Biden was sworn in, the New York Times published an article that the president was pursuing the biggest stimulus in history. And he says a lot of the stuff we just talked about. It is better to err on the side of too much rather than too little. That's Moody's Analytics chief economist Mark Zandi. Interest rates are at 0. Inflation is low. Unemployment is high. You don't need a textbook to know that this is when you push on the fiscal accelerator. Well, maybe if you'd looked at a textbook, we wouldn't be having this problem. So Biden echoed this line. "Let me be clear," he tweeted in February 21, "the risk in this moment isn't that we do too much. It's that we don't do enough. Congress must pass the American Rescue Plan to change the course of this pandemic and start our economic recovery. Critics included some economists associated with the Democratic Party. Remember Larry Summers, Obama's economic advisor? While there are enormous uncertainties, there is a chance that macroeconomic stimulus on a scale closer to World War II levels than normal recession levels will set off inflationary pressures of a kind we have not seen in a generation, with consequences for the value of the dollar and financial stability. Biden ignored Summers' call for a substantially smaller bill. The president flatly rejected a Republican counteroffer that would have cut the bill's cost to about $600 billion in more narrowly targeted pandemic relief. He offered no substantial criticism of the idea. He simply objected that it was too small. There was no risk in overreach. The only danger was in doing too little. Under Obama, Democrats had not only passed a sweeping stimulus plan, they'd pushed the Affordable Care Act, largest single expansion of federal social spending in decades. And they had increased the federal government's regulatory oversight in myriad ways, especially regarding the environment. Obama had often described his legislative achievements as middle-of-the-road compromises, but they were nothing if not ambitious. And then there was Donald Trump. Again, just in case you thought Republicans were blameless here, throughout his presidency, he publicly pressured the Fed to keep interest rates low and keep pursuing bond-buying monetary expansions. He tweeted in April 2019, "We have the potential to go up like a rocket if we did some lowering of rates, like 1 point, and some quantitative easing. Yes, we are doing very well at 3.2% GDP, but with our wonderfully low inflation, we could be setting major records and at the same time make our national debt start to look small." Inflation was low, in other words, so there was no real risk to stepping on the gas. Why not push the economy even harder? Even before Biden stepped into the Oval Office, Trump wanted to run the economy hot. And remember, when the COVID-19 pandemic set in, Congress passed and Trump signed the CARES Act, the largest fiscal stimulus in history. Combined with several follow-up packages, pandemic relief spending ultimately totaled about $6 trillion, all deficit financed. Okay, down a bit lower. At first, the Biden administration dismissed concerns about inflation, arguing that it would be temporary. So in June of 21, it ticked up to 5.4%. Biden said, "Our experts believe, and the data shows, that most of the price increases we've seen were expected to be temporary." I don't know what that noise is. I don't know if it's coming through the mic. But of course, prices kept rising. In December, after the year-over-year rate hit 6.8%, Biden admitted that inflation was a bump in the road, but also predicted the economy had reached the peak of the crisis. It hadn't. Prices rose every month for more than a year. In June of 22, the annual inflation rate hit 9.1%, the highest since November 1981. As prices continued to soar, Biden and his allies stopped insisting it would be temporary. Instead, they just said that it wasn't their fault. In late 21, remember Jen Psaki? She said the root cause was the pandemic. Elizabeth Warren, following a cohort of left-leaning policy activists, blamed greedy corporations exploiting the pandemic to raise prices on everyday essentials. In late 21, the New York Times reported, As rising inflation threatens his presidency, Biden is turning to the federal government's antitrust authorities to try to tame red-hot price increases. It's all the same as it was in the 70s. All the same. The only difference is the president didn't blame OPEC, but the Russo-Ukrainian war gave him his culprit. Inflation became Putin's price hike. In Congress and in the media, talk of price controls returned. In August 22, Jamal Bowman introduced the Emergency Price Stabilization Act, which calls for the federal government to build the capacity to establish limits on the growth of certain prices and to otherwise strategically regulate such prices in order to stabilize the cost of essential goods and services. A Princeton historian and Amherst economist argued in WAPO that the World War II era price controls were a total success, and the targeted price caps could effectively fight inflation again. Biden congratulated himself when a BLS report showed no overall inflation for the single month of July. Oh, you remember this one, don't you? I just want to say a number. 0. Today, we received news that our economy had 0 inflation in the month of July, 0%. I think he even did that prisoner, be seeing you thing. That's really kind of creepy, but all that meant was that in the month of July, it just hadn't got any worse. The same report showed the year-over-year inflation rate was 8.5%. So, then Biden declared in early 22 that fighting inflation will be his top priority, but declined to take straightforward steps to do so. Instead, his inflation-fighting commitment mostly turned out to mean he'd rebrand his familiar economic agenda as a series of inflation-fighting tools, which basically meant taking his Build Back Better plan and renaming it as the Inflation Reduction Act. Because if you just pass an act with that title, that's all that needs for it to happen. Despite its name, there was little reason to expect the law to have much impact on inflation, especially in the short term. Analysts said the Penn-Wharton budget model, a macroeconomic simulator, concluded that the act would have no meaningful effect on inflation in the near term. The White House's position was that the bill would help struggling families by making drugs, health insurance, and energy more affordable. The bill included a system of de facto price controls for drugs and Medicare, extended subsidies for individual market health insurance, the biggest benefit of which would go to six-figure earners, because of course it would, and various subsidies and tax credits designed to promote green energy, including an electric vehicle subsidy that, thanks to various Buy American rules, would apply to no vehicles now on the market. In short, the bill was supposed to fight inflation by hiding the true cost of goods and services through federal subsidies and price regulations. Maybe Nixon was right after all. The lesson that government price fixing doesn't work is never learned. And we've talked about that a couple of times, the problem of trying to affect the metric without actually affecting, the underlying problem, sort of like, cutting the wire to the check engine light when it comes on. Hey, look, I fixed the problem. Check engine light's not on anymore. No. You just affected the indicator. Is America of 2022 simply repeating the mistakes of the 60s and 70s? It isn't a note-for-note remake, but it does feel rather like a remix, a collage of historically familiar elements rearranged and repackaged in an updated aesthetic. If there is a lesson to be learned from the inflationary drama of the recent past, it is that inflation is to some degree a policy choice made for political reasons. And thus, as with Reagan in the 80s, it has both policy and political consequences. This time, however, the next Republican presidential nominee won't be Reagan. The resulting political and policy revolution, whatever form it takes, will almost certainly be one that Biden and his fellow Democrats find far from agreeable. When they object, it will be worth remembering they chose this path. They were warned, and they have no one to blame but themselves. Yep. Yeah. History doesn't repeat itself, as Mark Twain said, but it often rhymes. And this is rhyming like a rapper. It's pretty much note for note. Taken from the 70s, updated with, more modern rhetoric, but I guess the one good thing out of all this is I haven't really heard much lately from the modern monetary theorists, huh? I reckon they've gone slinking off in shame, but unfortunately they'll probably be back, and so the question is, will we have learned? Hopefully we will, and if we can actually get a way of getting better information out to the public, other than the government propaganda that disguises itself as a news media in this country, we might actually be able to do it. Who knows? But it starts with you and me sharing this video everywhere, hitting like, subscribe, and the bell, and of course, comments for the Common God, shares for the Share Throne. And please go to donate.bogosity.tv for all sorts of ways to support this channel, keep me doing what I do. I completely understand if you don't want to use PayPal. I know. I get it. I'm trying to get away from it myself, but I need it there for the people who still use it, so it's still there. It's still a thing you can do. But you can also do cryptocurrency and all sorts of other things, including becoming a regular supporter at Patreon and Subscribestar, get these videos early and ad-free, and other benefits like the monthly AMA and a special Discord access, things like that. Thank you so much. Until next time, stay strong and be free.